Okay, hello everyone. First of all, I would like to say sorry for yesterday's class. Unfortunately, we could not have it yesterday, and the reason was some technical issue because of what we could not have our class on like yesterday. So now today we are going to have the same session, right? So basically, when it comes to today's session, what is the the name of this session? The right strategy for this history optional. Like it's very important, and in fact, why this particular thing is so important, because I think if you have watched the class day before yesterday, in that case I was just trying to tell you one thing, that the way you perceive history, practically it's not like that, right? Practically, if you try to understand history, like when it comes to history as a subject in UPSC, in that case I did tell you that most of the people do understand it in a very traditional way, and that's the reason because of what they are not able to score very good. This subject itself is pretty dynamic, and that's the reason because of what you have to understand. Let's say, you have to understand the dimensions of the subjects, you have to understand the new dimensions which are coming into the subjects, right? So this is how, like, it becomes very important that you understand the, the nature of the subject. That's very important, right? And then simultaneously you understand okay, what are the expectations of the evaluators whenever they have been evaluating their script. So these are few things which are very important. And but here I would like to tell you one thing, that when it comes to writing the answers, like until and unless you understand the nature of subjects and the requirement of the question, I think you won't be able to understand what exactly the question has been looking for. So if you really wish to understand the demand of the question, for that you need to understand the nature of the questions also, the nature of the subject also. So this is the reason because of what the right strategy is very important. And in this particular class we are basically going to discuss the right strategy for UPSC for history optional. That's the main agenda that we do have, right? So first let me write that what is the title that we have. Title is there, so instead of wasting time for that, I think we should discuss about the strategy, right? So whenever you decide that you have taken history as an optional paper, there are two possibilities. The possibility number one is that you have already studied the subject. The possibility number one, that you have already studied the subject, right? That is one possibility. You have studied it. The second possibility, that you are not from this particular subject, right? You haven't studied ever history, so not from this subject, not from this subject. And in fact, you must have noticed that there were many people, those who haven't studied this subject, and they are also clearing UPSC with the help of this particular exam, with the help of history optional. So what is becoming important here, that either if you have studied it, like you have to understand that only by studying the subject your requirements are not getting fulfilled. Let me tell you why. Because if you have studied this subjects, you have mainly studied it in your graduation or let's say undergraduate courses, right? So in your UG courses or max to max your PG, you have done with this subject. Now, when you have been doing your undergraduation or let's say you have been doing your post graduation with this subject, that develops a different kind of skill or different kind of understanding for this subject. Either you say skill or let's say understanding of this subject, right? Right. So when what happens in your graduation, let's say undergrad courses or let's say the post graduation courses, you may notice one thing, that there basically you have been you are supposed to write either 4 or 5 answers. So you are getting 3 hours to write 4 or 5 answers. And on the other, when you are supposed to write 3 or 4, let's say 4 to 5 answers in 3 hours, in that case you do have ample amount of time to plan it and then to write it. First thing. The second thing, whenever the questions are being asked of let's say 50 markers or 60 markers, or let's say instead of marks, what is important, that in 3 hours you need to write just 3 or 4 or let's say 5 questions. जब 3 घंटे में आपको 3, 4 या 5 क्वेश्चंस लिखने होते हैं तो आपके पास जाहिर सी बात है ज़्यादा समय होता है जिसमें यू कैन एक्सटेंड योर आंसर, राइट? बट द पॉइंट इज नॉट अबाउट एक्सटेंडिंग द आंसर. द पॉइंट इज दैट like you have been asked only those dimensions of history which could really have this much content that you can really write in 1 hour, let's say 45 minutes. आपके पास जो है जो सवाल आपसे पूछे जाएंगे वो सवाल इतने इतने बड़े होंगे या इतना कंटेंट उसमें होगा कि उस सवाल को आप कम से कम 1 घंटे में या फिर 40 या 45 मिनट में आप लिख सकते हैं. इतना कंटेंट उस क्वेश्चन में जो है उस क्वेश्चन में या उस आंसर में होता है. बट व्हेन यू कंपेयर इट विद द यूपीएससी विद इन ए स्पैन ऑफ लेट्स से within a span of 3 hours, you need to write at least 16, 17 or 18 questions. That depends. In paper 1 you are writing 14 questions plus 1 map questions. On the other hand, in paper 2 you have been writing 10 and 19 questions, right? So you just try to understand the difference between these two. So in paper 1 you are writing 14 questions, in paper 2 you are writing 19 questions. तो एक में आप 14 या दूसरे पेपर में आप 19 क्वेश्चंस लिख रहे हैं. वक्त उतना ही मिलता है आपको, 3 घंटे का वक्त होता है. सो 3 घंटे के वक्त में क्या होता है कि 3 घंटे के वक्त में आपको बहुत अलग अलग डायमेंशंस पे जंप करना पड़ता है, ठीक है? और सबसे बड़ी बात है कि उन 3 घंटों के अंदर ही आपको उन सारे ही आंसर्स को लिखना होता है. दैट्स कंपल्सरी. मतलब आई एम जस्ट एक्सक्लूडिंग द चॉइसेस, आई एम ओनली टॉकिंग अबाउट द मिनिमम नंबर ऑफ क्वेश्चंस दैट यू नीड टू राइट. So what is important here, that you have to at least write everything or you have to complete all the answers. That's very important. So here what is the requirement, how to present the answer, that becomes really very very complicated thing. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing, when you have been studying some bigger portions of history, some bigger portions of history, let's say you have covered, let's say one dimension, and then suddenly you jump into the next dimension, and when you have been doing graduation with this subject, and then what happens, like you are missing the links, the connections between these, and that creates problem because these are some minor things which you do not understand. Why? Because you haven't covered them in your graduation or undergraduate courses, or let's say the postgraduate courses, and that's why you have been missing it. So that's the reason, because of what there is a vast difference between the history that you study in the academic world and the history that you study in UPSC. So here this subject demands a different kind of treatment, and if you are not able to somehow understand the requirement, in that case you won't be able to do justice with the paper. So hardly matters that whether you have studied the subjects or not, but one thing that you are definitely, or one edge that you have been getting, that if you have studied this subject, in that case you understand at least some of the core dimensions of the subject. Okay, you understand what exactly this subject is, because I think this is the biggest problem with majority of the people. They do not understand the nature of the subject. So in the case first, like when you have studied the paper, these difficulties you normally face. जब आप ये पढ़ चुके हैं पेपर, तो सामान्यतः आप ऐसी समस्याएं जो है वो फेस करते हैं. दूसरा केस क्या है? दूसरा केस है कि देयर यू हैवंट स्टडीड द सब्जेक्ट्स एट ऑल, राइट? यू आर नॉट फ्रॉम द सब्जेक्ट. probably you have done your graduation or post graduation with completely different people. There are many high chances that you have come from engineering or let's say medical background, and then you have decided to take history as an optional paper, and now you have been preparing for it, right? So what happens here that you need to understand, there you do not understand anything. And sometimes I feel that the people, those who are coming with a sort of fresh mind, they are more ready to adopt the kind of thing which they really need to understand. They more try to understand the subject with respect to the questions being asked in UPSC and the syllabus which has been given. कहने का तात्पर्य है कि अगर आपने वो सब्जेक्ट बिल्कुल नहीं पढ़ा तो आप बिल्कुल कोरे हैं, ठीक है? और जब आप कोरे हैं तब क्या होता है कि आप जब उस सब्जेक्ट को की शुरुआत करते हैं तो आप उस सब्जेक्ट के लिए जो है को एकोमोडेट करने के लिए आप थोड़ा सा अपने आप को लिबरल रखते हैं, ठीक है? तो उससे क्या होता है कि आप बेहतर समझ बना सकते हैं. और ये एक रीजन है जिसकी वजह से नॉन हिस्ट्री बैकग्राउंड के बच्चे बहुत क्लियर करते हैं हिस्ट्री को लेकर. ये एक बहुत बड़ा रीजन है जिसकी वजह से ऐसा होता है. इसका ये मतलब कतई नहीं है कि द पीपल दोज हु हैव स्टडीड हिस्ट्री they are not able to clear it. I think they are always there in a better condition to clear this examination with this subject. But the point is that you need to keep yourself open to accept the new ideas, the new things, and you need to understand the subject with a different perspective. That's the most important thing. So when you're not coming from the subject, then what happens, you need to start afresh, okay? You need to start from the scratch, and then you have to start studying about the subject. Got my point? So these are two different cases in which you normally understand, understand, or let's say prepare for this subject. Now when it comes to, let's say, what is this right strategy? So I think strategy is very similar to both of you, right? Whether you have studied this or you haven't studied that, studied this paper, hardly matters. The strategy remains same. So when it comes to framing the strategy, so I must tell you that while framing that strategy, you have to keep in mind one thing very clearly. What is history? That becomes a very important question. And I must tell you, most of you do not understand what is history. The first question itself you do not understand. Got my point? And this question is really very important. I remember when you go for, let's say, like the day you decided, okay, fine, I'll go with this history optional, and then what do? You just go to any senior, or let's say, what do you do apart from that? Like, you just consult some of the websites, some videos of certain toppers, and then they are recommending certain books. Then what do? You just buy these books and you start reading. Like, if you're coming from the subject, at least you do have some sort of understanding. If you are not from that subject, what, like the things or the content which is written in the book, you always take it as history. Rather, it is like, I must tell you, this is not history. ठीक है, जब आप ने उनको नहीं पढ़ा होता है, जब आप कुछ नहीं जानते हैं, ठीक है, आपने वो किताब खोली, ठीक है, आपको लगता है कि यही हिस्ट्री है जो इस किताब में लिखा हुआ है, जबकि ये वाकई सही नहीं है, ठीक है. एंड इन फैक्ट you do not understand that this particular subject is a discipline, right? There are certain things which are like, this subject is meant to deal with those questions, and that's why this subject has been meant. I hope you all understand that this is a subject which is being taught. This subject is being taught in most of the universities in the world. It's not India, it's not only like any state, any university that you talk about it, if it's not a university related to the professional courses. So you talk about the let's say state university, the central university, the deemed university, in every university this subject is being taught. So if this is such a popular discipline, there must be some logic behind it. Because of what this is such a popular discipline. So if it is so popular, so this particular subject does have meaning. So you need to understand the meaning of this subject, right? Meaning of this particular discipline. And that's the reason, because of what I must tell you, that instead of understanding first that what is written in the content, what is the syllabus which has been given, I think you should first focus on this particular question, that what is history. And let me tell you why it is so important. Such as, if I'm telling you that there is a question related to caste, right? There is a question related to caste. Now, caste is such an issue which is there not only in history, but it's there in political science, is there in anthropology, is there in sociology. So the same topic is there in the question, like in multiple disciplines. But if you think that in every discipline you need to treat with the questions in the same way, in that case, I must tell you that you haven't understood the significance of this subject. Okay? When you have been dealing with the caste question in historical aspect, there will be a completely different treatment which should be given to it. When you have been dealing it with dealing with this question in political science, आपको पूरी अलग तरीके से इसको डील करना पड़ेगा. There you need to see the caste with a completely different perspective. जब आप सोशियोलॉजी में डील करते हैं, जब आप एंथ्रोपोलॉजी में डील करते हैं, तो आपको इस सवाल को बिल्कुल अलग तरीके से देखने की जरूरत है. तो क्या है डिफरेंस, और आप कैसे समझ पाएंगे इस डिफरेंस को? इसको समझने के लिए शायद जो सबसे पहला सवाल है जो हमें समझना होता है कि हिस्ट्री क्या है. दैट्स द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट क्वेश्चन, एंड दैट्स द रीजन बिकॉज ऑफ व्हाट इट बिकम्स रियली इंपॉर्टेंट दैट यू फर्स्ट try to focus, try to understand, okay, this is the requirement of history, and that's the reason because of what I have been telling you repeatedly, this is the most important question. Take it. When I take classes, what I do, for coming, let's say for coming for a week, for let's say sometimes 10 days, I do not discuss anything. I do not discuss anything about the content. I try to simply explain the students that what is history. मैं साफ तौर पे ये समझाने की कोशिश करता हूँ कि इतिहास क्या है या हिस्ट्री क्या है. And the moment you started recognizing the nature of the subject, I must tell you that you are reaching to a very comfortable position. Then you start understanding कि अच्छा, like if I have been reading this particular topic, so this is the intention, like this is the main agenda behind it. So that's the reason because of what it is very important that you have to understand this question, what is history, right? Okay, fine. moving to the next question. Now the next question is also very important, and to a certain I think I'm not coming to the answer of this question. Maybe in another lecture I'll come up with the answer of this lecture. Now the second question, as I did tell you, the moment you decide that you'll go with this history optional, what do? You buy the books and you start reading it. I must tell you, my dear friends, that if you have been doing it in that way, your perception for the subject will be very very restricted. ठीक है, आपकी जो समझ होगी वो बड़ी नैरो सी समझ होगी, और आप कहीं ना कहीं उसी के साथ डील करेंगे. कि आप अगर यूपीएससी के क्वेश्चंस देखेंगे तो यूपीएससी के क्वेश्चन स्ट्रेट फॉरवर्ड नहीं आते हैं कि व्हाट वर द रीजंस फॉर द मुगल डिक्लाइन, राइट, और लेट्स से like the questions like what were the reasons for the rise of the Maratha, or what were the reasons for the, let's say, rise of Buddhism and Jainism. You won't find the questions are being asked in this way. The questions are always tricky. Like, so once the questions are tricky, how will you be able to understand it? They innovate with the questions. They do not innovate with the questions exactly, I must tell you. Basically what happens, the history is having that nature, but unfortunately you have tried to understand history only with the help of one book, and that's the reason because of what you are not able to comprehend the real demand of the question, and that's the reason because of what you face difficulties in understanding, in comprehending the question itself. So that's the okay, that's the reason, that's the reason because of what, like in the beginning itself, like one thing you fix up in your mind, what content is written in the book, that is not supposed to be history. The moment you keep on feeling like that, I must tell you are doing the mistake. Like, what is history? History is basically written by historians. There are two different kind of histories that you do read actually. Okay? One sort of history that you read in where you read in WhatsApp University. Okay? That's the kind of history that doesn't have any restriction. ठीक है, कोई बाउंडेशन नहीं है, आप जो लिखना चाहते हैं वो लिख सकते हैं. ठीक है, और कई लोग हैं इंडिया में जो जिसको हिस्ट्री समझते हैं. ठीक है, और इन फैक्ट लाइक व्हेन यू हैव बीन टीचिंग दिस सब्जेक्ट, लाइक वेरी फनी मोमेंट्स यू मे फेस, बिकॉज लाइक दिस इज अ सब्जेक्ट विच इज नॉट टू एवरीवन. ठीक है, हिस्ट्री एक ऐसा सब्जेक्ट है जो हर कोई जानता है. आपको अगर कभी भी लगता है कि आप कोई भी दुनिया में, इवन चाय दुकान में बैठे हुए जितने लोग आपको मिलेंगे, उसमें से सभी लोग हिस्ट्री जानते हैं. और द मोमेंट यू स्पीक something, you will open your mouth, they'll prove that you are you are a kind of useless fellow, you do not know history. They know the actual history. This is the destiny of this particular subject. Like, why? Because these kind of messages and the things which are happening, the way the history is being distorted, being very frank, I'll say, the way the history is being being distorted, because of this only, like there is a very wrong perception that has been carried for this particular subject. That's the reason because of what, like I must tell you very clearly that history is a subject which is written by historian. So anybody who is not professionally a historian, now this is also something very subjective, but for the sake of your convenience only I have been using this, कि अगर आपको लगता है कि कोई भी कुछ आके लिख रहा है वो हिस्ट्री है, ऐसा बिल्कुल भी नहीं है. आपको मैं साफ साफ बता दूं कि जब भी आप बात करते हैं कि हिस्ट्री जो है एक सब्जेक्ट के तौर पे, इसको लिखने वाले कुछ खास लोग होते हैं. ठीक है, उनके पास कुछ क्वालिफिकेशन होती है, उनके पास कुछ स्किल्स होते हैं, कुछ विजडम होता है जिसकी वजह से वो लोग लिखते हैं. एंड दैट्स द रीजन बिकॉज ऑफ व्हाट, लाइक द रोल ऑफ हिस्टोरियंस आर वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. हिस्टोरियंस आर वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट व्हेन इट कम्स टू द हिस्ट्री. सो व्हाट हैपेंस व्हेन, एंड लेट मी टेल यू वन मोर थिंग, whenever it is depending on individual, of course a historian is ultimately an individual, and then you need to understand one fact very clearly, like that if you are writing history, if I am writing history, like there are certain hypotheses we have been always carrying on, there are certain biases we are always carrying on. कहने का तात्पर्य क्या है कि कुछ ना कुछ पूर्वाग्रह जो है हमारे दिमाग में हमेशा होता है. अगर आपको लगता है, अगर आप ऐसा इस तरीके से सोचते हैं कि जो किताबों में लिखी गई है वो अकाट्य सत्य है, ठीक है, या उसके बाहर कुछ नहीं है, वही सही है, ऐसा नहीं है. हर वो इंसान जो है, वो चाहे हिस्टोरियन हो, चाहे प्रोफेशनली ट्रेंड ही हो, उनके अंदर भी कहीं ना कहीं कुछ बायसेस होती हैं. और यही रीज़न, अब अकेडमिक बायसेस अलग होती है, ठीक है, हम फिर किसी उस पर जो है बात करेंगे उसके बारे में. बट मैं इतनी सी आइडिया आपको कन्वे करना चाहता हूँ कि अगर आप सोचते हैं कि किसी ने कुछ लिख दिया और वो वही हिस्ट्री है, वो गलत है. लाइक लाइक देर आर सर्टन इवेंट्स विच हैपन इन पास्ट, देर आर सर्टन इवेंट्स विच हैपन इन पास्ट, एंड these events have been, events have been seen by them, studied by them in their own way. So probably Mr. X, the way studied the same event is not similar to the way Y studies this particular event. जिस तरीके से X उस इवेंट को समझते हैं, जरूरी नहीं कि Y भी उसी तरीके से समझते हैं. हो सकता है दोनों का देखने का नजरिया बिल्कुल भी अलग अलग हो, और इसकी पॉसिबिलिटी हो ही नहीं सकती, ऐसी ऐसी चीजें होती है. ठीक है, तो जब आप मिस्टर X की किताब पढ़ते हैं, when you have been reading the book of Mr. X, like of course you have been reading only the only, let's say, the perception, or only the perception of Mr. X. जिस तरीके से एक्स ने समझने की कोशिश की, आपने वो पढ़ लिया. ठीक है, और आपने क्या किया, जब आप एग्जामिनेशन हॉल में जाते हैं तब आपने जो पढ़ा उसको जाके लिख दिया और चीजें खत्म हो गई. ठीक है, लेकिन अगर क्वेश्चन मिस्टर वाई के पर्सपेक्टिव से पूछा गया है, लाइक तब फिर आप क्या करेंगे, आप इसको कैसे मैनेज करेंगे? दैट बिकम्स द रियल डिफिकल्टी इन हिस्ट्री, एंड दैट्स व्हाई इफ यू थिंक दैट इन हिस्ट्री यू आर नॉट सपोज टू रीड अबाउट द स्कॉलर्स, यू डोंट नीड टू रीड अबाउट, लेट्स से, historians and all, that's incorrect, right? This is not correct, because yes, you have to study history also with respect to the historian, and I must tell you that if you do not do it, in that case it's going to be very tough for you, right? Tough for you to comprehend the subject. So I think there should be clarity that if something has been written, any statement is there, let's say any statement is there, that statement has been ultimately given by a person, and like there are chances that it is partially correct, it is partially partially incorrect also. So I think you should be very open for this particular thing, that you have to have, like you should have a kind of open mindedness ki okay, if something has written like this or in this way, and if somebody else has been saying it in a, or understanding it in a different way, so I think I need to find the midline, I think I need to present it in the same way. So just make one thing very clear in your mind, that history is something which is written by historians, and that's why you also need to understand with the same perspective, right? So I think this is the second dimension which is very important, and fix it in your mind that history, like any content that you have been reading, that is not the absolute history. ठीक है, वो पूरी तरीके से संपूर्ण इतिहास या कंप्लीट इतिहास बिल्कुल भी नहीं है. तो जब भी आप इतिहास की किताबें पढ़ते तो कभी भी इस माइंडसेट के साथ मत पढ़िएगा यही कंप्लीट या पूरा इतिहास है. ठीक है, तो तीसरी बात, the third thing which is again very important, and what is that third thing? The third thing is about basically we can say the third thing is about the sources. Now that's again very important thing, and I think the way history is incomplete without the historians, in the same way history is incomplete without the sources as well. ठीक है, like there are two words that you must have heard in your life, like always. One is history, the another one is fiction. Now the point is that what is the difference between history and fiction, right? So when you watch the film, let's say Padmavat or let's say Mohenjo-daro, तो आप फिल्मों को देख के हिस्ट्री क्यों नहीं पढ़ लेते? क्या फ़र्क है दोनों में? फ़र्क ये है कि एक जो है बहुत एक ने जब भी कुछ लिखा है, सपोज यू हैव बीन रीडिंग एनीथिंग विच इज़ केप्ट इन द कैटेगरी ऑफ हिस्ट्री, that is always referring the sources. You cannot write anything. That's the limitation that the historians do face, and I think in fact this is what keep them disciplined. अगर आप किसी डिसिप्लिन में नहीं है तो आप कुछ नहीं कर सकते हैं. ठीक है, तो जो हिस्टोरियंस होते हैं वो क्या करते हैं, उनके पास एक लिमिटेशंस होती है कि जब भी उनको कुछ लिखना होता है तो उनको दे नीड टू रेफर द सोर्सेज, कि अच्छा इस सोर्स में ये रेफर किया गया है और इस सोर्स को इन लोगों ने इंटरप्रेट करके एक कंक्लूजन दिया या फिर एक जो स्टेटमेंट दिया. दैट्स हाउ इट इज इंपॉर्टेंट. सो व्हेन यू हैव बीन reading something which is not, let's say, which is not developed, which is not restricted by any source, in that case there is no importance of that in history. So source is something which actually creates the difference between the history and the fiction. Got my point? And this is the third thing that you have to keep in mind, that you should always try to understand the subject with respect to the sources. That's the third thing. Now what is the importance of sources? Like that importance also do differ in different areas. When you have been reading ancient, like the sources are more important. When you have been reading medieval, the sources are lesser important. When you have been reading the modern India and the modern world, probably the sources are not that much important, like ancient and medieval India. So the importance of sources also do differ. And in fact, I would again discuss about these dimensions also in any other lecture. So moral of the story is this: the moment you decide that you are going with this history optional, there are three questions which should be always in mind, or there are three things which should be always fixed in your mind. Ki history should be understood with this particular perspective only, right? So be very clear that whenever it comes to history, like these are three things that you have to keep in mind. Then the next thing that, and the last thing for today's lecture that I'm going to discuss, that what you should do in the beginning, right? The last thing that I'm saying in this particular session, that what exactly you are supposed to do in your what exactly you are supposed to do in your let's say in your beginning days of your preparation. There are two things that you need to make always, or in fact you need to develop this habit. So the moment you decide that okay, you'll go for the go for this history optional. In fact, this happens with most of the optional paper. The moment you decide you will go for this optional paper, you directly pick up the content, you start reading it. I think that is not giving you the proper, let's say, the proper guide. It's not providing you the proper guide. So what you are supposed to do, the first thing, that you see the syllabus of the first see the syllabus. Now, why syllabus? In the last session itself, I had been emphasizing on the significance of the syllabus. I did tell you that syllabus are very important, because the moment you see the syllabus, you understand the boundaries within which you need to play. Suppose you just imagine that you do not know of the boundary in which you need to play. In that case, how come you're going to play? So that is fixing up the boundary, and that's the reason because of it, it's very important. And the second thing I'll say, the second thing which again becomes very important, that is previous year questions. Now that's the another thing which makes it very important. Now what are the significance of the previous year question? And in fact, I'll suggest you to see the questions from, let's say, 2010 or let's say 2011 to 2020, right? Now be 2021 bhi aane wala hai, so 2010 to 2021, let's say the questions of last 10 years, these questions are very important. Why am I confining you only to the last 10-year questions? Because as I did tell you that history itself has gone through a kind of change, and that's the reason because of what you need to understand. In past 10 years, the nature of question had gone through a drastic change, and you need to understand the modern, or let's say the contemporary requirement of the questions, contemporary requirement, rather than the kind of questions being asked in the previous times. They were totally different. I think in that particular period, only 5 questions you are supposed to write, and again the same academic sort of thing was there. But here, like, you need to write smaller dimensions, and that's the reason you'll be able to understand okay, this is the syllabus, these are the questions, and then try to match these two, try to compare these two, because the moment you start comparing and matching them, then you realize one thing, what happens, there were many dimensions given in the syllabus, but it's very much possible that all the dimensions are not very important. And in fact, there are certain dimensions which have really become very old, and they are not being asked very frequently in the paper. Let me give you some example for this. Let's say, if you'll see the papers before 2010, in that case you'll find that the Chola local self-government, right, that was very frequently being asked. Then the nature of Ganasanghas. So nature of Ganasanghas are still being asked, but the local self-government of the Cholas are not being asked in the same way, rather it is being framed in a different way. So what happened to these topics? Initially, like when we used to prepare, we were pretty sure that the moment, like if this year they haven't asked this question, next year definitely they're going to ask this question. But how come these questions are these questions have become so much irrelevant? These have become irrelevant because in the new history which is being written, and some sort of clarity is coming on several topics, and after the clarity, these topics do not remain very important. Got my point or not? क्या हुआ, लोकल पहले हम मानते थे कि चोला गवर्नमेंट, जो चोला लोकल सेल्फ गवर्नमेंट है, वो बाकी लोकल सेल्फ गवर्नमेंट की तरह था. इस वजह से क्या होता है, इस वजह से जो है वो पूछते थे. बाद में रियलाइज़ हुआ ये नहीं, बहुत फ़र्क है दोनों में, और अगर इतना फ़र्क है दोनों में तो फिर जो है इसकी बात करना ही बेईमानी है. ठीक है, इट्स नॉट वेरी रेलेवेंट और लॉजिकल टू टॉक अबाउट इट. And that's why people have stopped, or historians have stopped talking a lot about it. And now you'll find that the new dimensions were being brought. So of course there are certain dimensions where clarity are coming, and that's why either they are becoming more relevant, or else they are not becoming relevant at all. So try to get my point. If you do not understand history with that perspective, if you are not capable of doing the analysis with that particular perspective, I think that's completely illogical to prepare with this subject. At least this kind of wisdom you should have. You should should like think about the subject, you should see into the subject with that perspective, you should analyze by your own key, okay, this has become irrelevant and this has become like more relevant. So if that clarity is there, in that case you'll be able to of course minimize the syllabus. So that at least when you start preparing this subject, I must tell you that these are certain key areas that you have to keep in mind. Got my point? So in this particular session, I was just giving you some hint about the way you are supposed to do it. And as I told you that there are certain dimensions which are very important dimensions, so I'll come up with some more lectures with these dimensions, and we'll target them individually, and then only we'll try to understand okay, this is how you need to understand it. So I think a great amount of clarity is required on all these three things. So very soon I'll come up with those lectures also where we'll try to discuss about these aspects also, right? So in this particular session, I'm just ending it here only. Tomorrow again there is a lecture, and that is about the mapping segment, right? That's again very important segment. So I have kept it separately. Why I have kept it separately? Because that is important, that gets you good marks, and that's why I have kept it separately. And I'll try to get you sub guidelines, some suggestions as far as this map portion is concerned, right? So we'll be dealing with this the next topic like tomorrow, and then see you in tomorrow's class with this mapping section, right? So that's all for today. Thank you all of you for joining the session. Like tomorrow again we'll be meeting with a new session. Thank you very much. Good night.